Hey, all, welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It's Friday, February 4th. Happy Friday, February 4th to the people who've been looking forward to this day. It's finally here. I don't know who that is, but Doug Pagitt here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, joined by Daniel Deitrich, the good old producer of this regular effort.
Hey.
Out of South Bend, Indiana.
That's right.
And we have another economics professor. A professional in the fields of economics to help us understand what common good economics could look like. And Ron, you are in Mississippi.
Correct. I am at Ole Miss, although I'm representing my alma mater today with an Auburn shirt on. So, I didn't know we were going to be on camera, and I maybe, hopefully I don't get fired for this.
Well, you look great.
You know, what's on your chest tells you what's in your heart. So we all know. We all know what's going on there. Hey, we like to chat about the weather just for a minute because this is the one thing we all have in common. It's going to be a lovely weekend here in Minneapolis. We might hit 30 degrees tomorrow. And I have a bunch of friends that live near one of our city lakes, and we're going to go out tonight and cut a big circle hole in it and then make a merry-go-round out in the middle of this lake. I'll post some videos later.
Really?
It's gonna be awesome.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a real to-do. How are things shaking up there, Dan, in South Bend? You guys hanging in there?
We're day 3 of snow days here, so we've been at home for 3 days and getting a little stir crazy. But we might go cross-country skiing today. So,
have you done this before, cross-country skiing?
I've done it 2 or 3 times, and yeah.
Now, to be clear, when one cross-country skis, that's not like cross-country biking, where you actually bike across the country.
Don't cross the country itself, in its entirety.
It's sort of like flatland skiing.
Yeah.
But the hardest thing I do, I think it's just tremendously hard. I watch the cross-country skiers and think those people are...
Yeah, it's way harder than just walking. It's like a lot more energy.
Yeah. Just walk. Hey, is this because the Olympics, the Winter Olympics have launched and there's going to be people out, performing at the highest level of cross-country skiing? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Cross-country skiing.
Watching people doing the highest level of it, I'm going to start at the bottom. So,
yeah, happy Olympics kickoff day too. Hey, Ron, what's the forecast looking like there in what part of Mississippi is the University of Mississippi located?
So we're in Oxford, which is about an hour, 15 minutes south of Memphis.
Okay.
So on the northern border there with Tennessee. I think tomorrow's a high of 40. I was supposed to go golfing. I'm not convinced that golfing is going to happen. So.
No, unless you have the winter golf gloves. All right, Ron, we're glad to have you here. You know, we often have people from the perspective of economics that's called modern monetary theory. And a number of us have become very intrigued with many of the notions that we've learned from people who hold these views, modern monetary theory, including that the federal government is a sovereign distributor of its own currency and therefore plays by a different set of rules than every other entity in the world. So the federal government's treatment of its own money is different. It can make whatever money it wants. That's how it functions in the world, we've been told. And that our tax dollars are actually a part of alleviating the amount of money in the economy. Our tax dollars to the federal government are not used to recycle that money back into other projects. So we don't wait to raise taxes before the government spends money. The federal government spends money and then takes money out through taxes and through other purposes. That's been a very revelatory experience for a lot of us. And from there, a number of other implications of what that then means for our social implications and how we should be thinking about economics is true. And that's by MMT people's own statements. That's a peculiar view. It's a different view. They even like the phrase modern monetary theory to say that they now understand some things about how economics works in this strange condition of the United States. You come from a more traditional view, or maybe you'd like to say a less strange view than the MMT side. Is that a fair way to say it?
Yeah, I would say that my economic. So MMT's on like one edge of economics. So if we think about heterodox being either of the poles, you got MMT on one side. I think you did a podcast on libertarians this week. Like libertarians, you could think of the other side. And then like I'm in the middle.
Okay. All right. So before we get into the details of all that, how does a nice Auburn guy like you end up as an economics professor anywhere? Let alone in Mississippi. Well, how does somebody, and why did you decide to not only study economics but then want to teach economics to college students?
Yeah, so my dad got his PhD in finance while I was in middle school. So I kind of got exposed to that. Spent a lot more time in my household watching CNBC on the couch than movies. I went to Auburn for undergrad. Was fortunate enough to go there. And from day one, I opened up a Principles of Microeconomics book, read the whole thing in the first 2 weeks of class, and I called my dad and I was like, "Hey, I don't think I should be an engineer. I think I should be an economist."
What was it in there? What was it that struck you in there that you said, well, these are the people I want to keep talking to for my adult life?
Well, I think like to some extent, a lot of economists I know, like they open up an econ book and they're like, "Oh my gosh, that's the way my brain already works." So there's like a selection bias of,
yeah,
it's like, oh, like I was already thinking this way. Here's a formal way of approaching it. Let me study this more and think more along these lines. Now, I ended up studying mathematics at Auburn. The nice part of having a dad who's a PhD is he was able to give me some guidance of like, hey, if you think you want to get a PhD in finance or economics, you don't actually need an econ degree. You need a math degree. So then I got into grad school at Notre Dame, went up there, got my PhD in economics. That's where I met Dan. Met my wife in South Bend. So that was good.
I like to think I played a small role in making that match, but
I mean, you had her singing on stage the first time I saw her, so there's that. But,
and this was at a church you worked at, not a nightclub or something. Dan wasn't the owner of a nightclub and had her up on stage showing her off. This was at a church.
This was at a church, yeah.
I was the music person there.
A church that met at a bar, though, so like I can tell people we met at church, but it's really just
Nice. Hey, what years was this that you were in college and then graduate school and PhD? When was this?
Yeah, so I was in high school during the heart of the financial crisis. So also like I'm like an adolescent, 16, as all that was going on. So like that definitely sparked some intrigue. And then I was in college from 09 to 13, and then graduate school from 13 to basically 18. So,
all right, and now you're teaching. Now that we're, I don't know, a decade sort of past some of those issues that caused the economy to crash because of decisions made by policymakers and economists, informed by economists. You probably didn't have the benefit in your graduate school or college to really know all, to have the deep analysis have been done on that period of time from sort of, whenever you mark it, 1998 through 2008 or whatever period of time, people like you understand that the conditions were set for our banking system to come to near collapse. But now, do you have some perspective on that? And are you now as a professor, starting your career as a professor, do you have access to understanding some things about what caused the financial crisis? And I don't know how economists talk about this, but the rest of us talk about it as sort of very, very difficult days when we feel like the system didn't save us. Do you know now what happened differently than when you were in graduate school?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of nailed the problem of no one really understood exactly what was going on. So like when I was undergrad, especially, and taking macroeconomics courses, the professor was kind of spitballing all the time of like, well, this is what I think now. Now I feel like we have a slightly better understanding. When I teach this to my students, the way I talk about it is we had some financial instruments that are meant to insure everybody from what we would call, like fancy term is idiosyncratic risk, but it's the risk that I individually default on my mortgage. And so those financial instruments took a lot of people like me, put us together, and they were able to construct like this safer asset. And the asset's safer as long as you don't get like the probability that everyone defaults at the same time wrong. and they got that way wrong.
Right.
So, so, so when it comes to the financial collapse, like that's where that's centered, is just a mispricing of risk. Now, the part we don't necessarily understand very well is still like, why did house prices run up? Basically up to 2006, and then why'd they fall off? Because the fall off is really like the catalyst of the whole thing. Why things played out after that is about the structure of the financial system. But like, I think that like understanding why housing prices or any asset price in general kind of blows up and then comes back down is still very much an open question.
And this sits at the heart of what we want to talk with you about today, is how to understand inflation. That was an inflation move inside of a major sector. So I guess when it happens inside one sector, people call it a spike, but when it happens across the whole system, they call it inflation. Is that accurate? Like, it's the same thing, a spike in a sector versus inflation across the system.
Yeah, so I think that gets to a good point in like a common misperception of what we're talking about when we talk about inflation. So when I talk about inflation, I mean changes in the average price level, so changes in the price of all goods. When we talk about like changes in housing prices leading up to 2006, that's a change in a relative price, meaning like the price of housing went up, but not necessarily the price of all other goods. And so that's going to change your allocation across different goods. So changes in relative prices. Here's a good example. And it's slightly misleading because I'll tell you why it's misleading in a second. But in Oxford, Mississippi, over the past 2 years, beef prices, or wait, how many years we've been in COVID? It's 2022 right now. So 2 years.
It's been a time warp.
Yeah, over the last 2 years, beef prices here have been very, very high because we don't have a lot of beef manufacturing in the state. It's hard to get here. And so like our beef prices have gone up more than my grandparents who live in Omaha, Nebraska. But our chicken prices are pretty much the same because we have all the chicken plants. And so my wife and we just haven't bought beef. I think I bought beef on Memorial Day, the first year of COVID, and I have not bought beef at the store since then because that's a change in relative prices. So changes in relative prices cause me to allocate differently across goods, beef versus chicken, versus when the price level is going up, like general inflation, that's going to cause me to reduce my spending overall because I can't buy as much stuff.
I see. And you don't attribute that to the Chick-fil-A commercials where the cow is saying "eat more chicken." That thing. That's not what it is. That the big beef industry is trying to keep you from eating cows. Okay. So here's what I find curious about this, Ron. Every time there's a crisis in the system, whether it's in a sector, housing has gone up, oil went up, beef has gone out of control. Lumber, people tried to buy lumber, remember that 12 months ago or something. It's like, my gosh, a 2x4 at Home Depot. People will say like, oh, we know why that happened. But then it gets to be a real problem. And then people start saying, yeah, we don't actually know why that happened. So how do economists feel confident saying, oh, we can tell you what causes inflation. We just can't tell you about any increase in a particular sector. We don't understand that. Like internally in the system, is there less confidence in how deep their understanding of the cause and effect goes than there is when this stuff gets put out on CNBC or on podcasts like this, or general understanding of economics?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple ways to answer that question. One is like something that one of my colleagues emphasizes here with our graduate students, and it's a quote from someone else, but I'm forgetting their name. It's never reason from a price change. So what that means is you can observe price changes. However, there's lots of things that could happen as to why the price changed. So just think about like a simple microeconomics, supply and demand type graph. Firms offer more, or sorry, I shouldn't even say firms. Sellers of a product will offer more of the product when the price goes up. That just says supply curve slope upward. Purchasers of a product are going to purchase less of it when the price goes up. So your demand for Chick-fil-A goes down as Chick-fil-A prices rise. Both of those lines, though, there's a relationship there between how much you want to buy and the price of the good, and how much someone wants to sell and the price of the good. And so as long as you have both of those relationships, we can determine like this is how much of the good is sold and this is the price it's sold at. However, like there's a lot of things going on in the background as to why those lines intersect where they do. And so on one hand, why could the price of a good go up? The price of a good could go up if for some reason there's just less of it. So for instance, I'm trying to think of a non-controversial example. None of the examples you just gave. Well, I guess here in Mississippi, like beef production fell across the country. And so that's going to cause the supply of beef to decline. We're more sensitive to that decline because we're further away from beef manufacturers. And so the price went up because of a supply issue. Alternatively, it could have just been that me and my friends, like, you know, just decided we like beef. Like we bought into the Jim Harbaugh thing that chicken's a disgusting bird. And we just started buying more beef. And that's a demand effect. And so that statement of never reason from a price change is that you got to have an understanding of like the underlying framework of how the market works to talk about where that price change is coming from. So someone in here said used car prices, for instance. Dave McDermott just brought this up in the chat. Yeah. So used cars are super interesting because what drove used car prices going up a lot is the fact that new car production declined. So new car production basically came to a halt because of the chip shortage.
Right.
There are still people who need to buy cars, who are in the market for buying a new car because they just can't keep driving, you know, their beater around. And so those people still got to buy a car. And so they don't have, there's a limited supply of the new cars. They now got to go to there's extra demand then in the used car market because of this lack of supply of new cars. And so that drove up used car prices a ton. And so you have to understand, like, where's that extra? It's not like the supply of used cars. Now, the supply of used cars does decline a little bit because people held on their cars longer since they can't buy a new car. But there's a lot of things going on there to say, why did used car prices go up when it was a lack of new cars in the market that we were observing? So
I know that it is gospel in economics to say that supply affects price. That just feels like that's one of the unquestionable beginning points. Yeah. But does it? Like do real sellers of things have the ability to just be changing prices? So I just think nowhere in my life, anyone who runs any business I know of, my wife is a yoga instructor, we run a nonprofit, I have a friend that sells medical equipment. None of these people can change their prices because a whole lot, like when my wife gets a bunch more people that want to come to a yoga class, she's not like, well, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to charge $3 more per class. Like there's so much that goes into that it doesn't feel at all. And then I'm going to throw one more analogy in here. I think in 2001, I bought a MacBook computer from Apple and it was $2,400.
Right.
And last year I bought a MacBook and it was $2,400. And it's the most, like they picked a price 20 years ago and just never changed it and are so profitable. So I don't know. Is it actual? I mean, I get this theory of demand and supply and cost, but in the real world, it seems like that's not how this happens at all.
Yeah. So there's like two really interesting intuitive points that you're bringing up there. One is sticky prices, and the other is something else I want to talk about, which is like that MacBook pricing. Okay. So let's talk about sticky prices first. So when I teach macroeconomic theory to my students, we start with a flexible price world. What I mean by that is what I was saying before. If suppliers can change their prices, what you're getting at and what John Maynard Keynes was thinking about is, hey, in the short run, prices are sticky. Prices are sticky for a number of reasons. We don't need to talk about why prices are sticky. They just are. And so within certain industries, like your wife's yoga studio, prices are more sticky than others. So I will say, like, there is a business that we all use on a weekly basis that has infinitely flexible prices. And we know this because they invest a lot in letting you know the price changed. So do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Gas prices.
Yes. So gasoline is a good where the price is adjusting like immediately. So like there are businesses where it's flexible. You see this too now. Like there are other businesses where it's not. So one time in graduate school, I went to Chipotle and I got to the point where I knew how much my chicken bowl cost, and I was a grad student, so I was walking in there with exact change.
Yeah.
And I walked in there with exact change, and I mean I had debit card, but like I'm not interested. This is a principle of the matter. I walked in there with exact change, and they raised prices.
Uh-oh.
And so I walked out because I didn't have the money, and I was mad. And so,
and you were only going to get a burrito bowl with guacamole. You weren't going to not get the guacamole that time just to hit your
I'm
price
not
point.
changing my order. Like my preferences are fixed.
Got it.
So like, you know, there's lots of reasons why companies don't change prices. And that's an example of one of like, if the price is moving around a lot, your people who are coming in often are going to get upset, and you're going to get less business. So in reality, prices are somewhat sticky. And so when I teach macroeconomic theory to my students, we talk about two extremes at first. One extreme is prices are flexible, and the other extreme is prices don't change at all. And when we talk about like the underworkings of the economy, I like those two extremes because they basically give you all the political arguments of either, you know, faction, whether it's Republican or Democrats or, you know, political parties in another country. Everything can be thought of as being on this continuum of, at least with regard to economics, of are prices flexible or not? And then reality is somewhere in the middle. So why is it somewhere in the middle? One, your wife might change her yoga studio prices every couple years. Or, you know, you sign contracts as a teacher for a year and your wage can adjust. So we just think wages are prices of labor. So like in the long run, prices are definitely flexible. They're definitely flexible because firms can adjust. Now in the short run, they are somewhat sticky, and understanding when prices change in the short run is like an open research area of research.
And would you say it seems like, you know, Chipotle, for example, their prices go up because the cost of, you know, organic food sources go up. But then if those, you know, source prices go down, a company rarely reduces their prices to reflect that. They're just happy to pocket that extra profit. What do you call that in the economics world, where the hesitancy to reduce prices?
Yeah, so like convincing economists that prices are sticky at all. There's some people who are like, that's dumb, like from a philosophical standpoint. But like you actually get a lot more credibility on this notion of downward price rigidity. So my gasoline example, for instance, gas prices are a perfect example of, you know, if something happened in the Middle East today, gas prices would respond today. But if like we found a new supply of oil today, it would take like a month for gas prices to adjust. So like there is a notion of downward price rigidity. Now, like with food and stuff like that, like the question is, basically there's periods of time where McDonald's is going to be making a high profit margin, and there's periods of time where McDonald's is going to be making a lower profit margin because the prices of their inputs are changing, but their posted prices are not. And so like McDonald's is internalizing, this is kind of getting theoretical at this point in abstract, but there's a question of if McDonald's is going to have like time varying profit margins, but you know how much McDonald's is going to cost all the time, maybe you should pay them a premium for the fact that they're internalizing the like time varying profit
the fluctuations.
Yeah, so like they're bearing the risk of fluctuations, you're not in that situation. And so like
Okay.
I could say like it's worth the premium is like when they have high profit margins, it's compensating them for when they have low profit margins. So does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And the other thing that gets me about this is so often when we talk about how much money a family has or a person has, and you look back a year or 5 years or 10 years, this is very common what I hear in inflation conversations. And then they say, people just have less money in their bank account. It doesn't take into account that many of us from year to year or decade to decade spend money on more and different things. We're not just buying the same things over and over. And it feels like in some of the economics conversations that we approach it as if there's a closed system of what you buy. You always buy rice, you always buy beans, and that's about it. But instead, somebody's like, I had to buy a ring light this time, or I decided to go on vacation, or I got an electric mower this year because I didn't want to pay for gas. Like the system is so complex. People are buying such different things. To try to like nail this moment of a selected number of items that we peg inflation rates to, and that's a debated, question about what's even in the basket, the common basket that sets inflation rates. I'm not saying economics doesn't have a role, but isn't this much more like psychology or philosophy than it is, I don't know, like biology or chemistry?
Yeah, like it's very imperfect. So what you're talking about with regard to the way you're describing inflation or I guess price levels is this idea of the consumer price index, which the consumer price index is take a basket of goods, calculate the price of that basket today versus 10 years ago. And that tells you a little bit about prices. Now, the CPI is one option for talking about inflation.
Oh.
It is an option that is talked about in the news the most, like your headline numbers. However, and it's because it's easy to communicate. Like now underneath like that basket, I'm going to be honest, I have no idea who selects the basket, how it's maintained, all that stuff. Like that's not what I'm interested in. If I wanted to understand that, I would work at like the Bureau of Economic Analysis or something. But like they are updating that basket to reflect like we buy computers now instead of typewriters.
Sure.
The MacBook that you bought a decade ago, or you said 20 years ago for $2,400 is vastly different than the MacBook you bought today for $2,400. And also $2,400 is a lot different. $2,400 doesn't mean the same thing. So like, for instance, in today's dollars, that you spent like $4,200 on that MacBook 20 years ago.
Totally. It's gotten cheaper.
Your MacBook today is way cheaper. And so there's quality innovation. There's the supply chain adjusts to like creating these goods different. So your whole point of, hey, that basket is changing a lot is well taken. And we do our best as economists. Like there are plenty of people who are thinking about these problems and they're adjusting that basket over time, or they're like you hear this concept of chain weighted price measures, which is actually that they're not doing a comparison from one year to the other, but they're doing like lots of comparisons and averaging them all out. So I could compare 2020 to 2010, 2020 to 2000, and take an average of those comparisons.
So if CPI is one way to get to inflation, there's many more, or there's one other. How many other indicators are there?
So I would say, like, in a principles of macro class, I'm teaching two.
Okay.
I'm teaching CPI, which has a subset of problems like the ones you described, but we could talk about other issues with it. And I'm teaching the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator is saying it's a little bit different than CPI. The way the deflator works is you say, hey, everyone bought a bunch of stuff today. That's GDP. What if the price of those goods that they bought today had been their price from a decade ago? And so, like, your MacBook would be, and your Mac will adjust for inflation. So your MacBook would be weighted at $4,400 or whatever today, in that real GDP calculation. But what's something that's gone down in price? Toys. Like, if you want to see a real change, go look at the price index for toys. Toys are like super cheap now, and so the price of toys goes down. But when you take all of the goods in the economy and you add them up this way, and you say, hey, let's hold the quantity that were purchased constant, but let's compare today's price to a price 10 years ago on this good. Then you get an idea of like an average price change across all of the goods purchased. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the difference is in that one is like you're not holding the bundle.
Got
fixed. So
yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the conversation around climate change and climate modeling. Like it's so complex and there's so many variables that your instinct is to say there's no way people can predict anything about something so complex. But we do. We figure out ways of sampling and aggregating data to make predictions. But the danger is one thing doesn't line up and people are like see it's snowing in Texas. Climate change isn't real. You know, like people use the outliers to discredit the whole thing.
Yeah, so something I would say to that before we move on is just like so we want to know what the total price level is, and we can't observe that because it just doesn't exist. We see the price of individual goods. We have a couple ways of estimating the average price level with with GDP deflator versus CPI, and you're right that those two things can be different, and it makes you want to say like throw the whole thing out. But the key is to understand like what's the weakness of each measure, and recognizing like what I tell my students is like, hey, both of these measures are imperfect, but the real price level is somewhere in between the two. Or inflation specifically, like when you calculate inflation with these two measures, it's going to look different across the two measures. But inflation is like somewhere between the two is the way to think about it. So I think don't throw out all the estimates just because they're different. You just got to understand the weaknesses of the two and why they're different, and then be like, oh, reality's like somewhere around this. So.
Got it. Okay, so it's always approximate, which is helpful as opposed to exacting. That's what I hear you reminding us of. One of the big questions that's on people's minds today who think about this stuff is the issue of inflation, what causes it, and the relationship of government debt. So in the last two economics conversations that we've had, we listened to Stephanie Kelton's book called The Deficit Myth. The title of the book tells you something about the opinion, right? That government deficits are not something to be afraid of. And I think the way she explains it, I have become somebody who purports to this idea that that deficits are not the same as personal or corporate debt, and we should stop using the same word for both of those. You know, it's like when you're a kid and you're riding down the road and you say to your mom, "What does inflammable mean?" That's written on the side of a tanker truck, and they say, well, it means it'll burn. You say, I thought that meant flammable. You're like, yeah, they're two words that mean the same thing. In this case, it's the opposite. Deficit doesn't mean the same thing, it seems to me. So that's a question, and the question about inflation. Some people say, Joe Manchin and others, putting too much government money into an economy causes inflation. It makes all prices go up because there's too much money available. I totally don't understand that argument. Other people say the only thing that causes inflation, overstating only slightly, the only thing that causes inflation is a lack of resources. There's not enough of the product. Why are there inflationary pressures right now? Because of the pandemic. That's it. Not because of government spending. So can you talk about those two things? How do you see deficits? We talked before we came on, and you said that you thought deficits were something we should worry about. I've now become convinced it's something we shouldn't, and convince me otherwise. If you would abuse me of such nonsense that I'm believing. And where do you see this relationship of the amount of money in the system having to do with inflation? Is that actually a part of the problem or not?
Yeah. So there's a couple ways to approach this conversation. First is like ignore money for a second.
Okay.
Like money doesn't matter. My job title, I think, technically says monetary economist, and like in my class, we don't talk about money till like the last week. Okay, so ignore money for a second,
Okay.
and let's talk about why government spending can cause like what happens when there's more government spending. So deficits are either driven by the government's not taxing us enough, or the government spending too much. So like one thing I like to tell my students is, and this is, I was taught economics by a super libertarian guy, so maybe that's revealing my bias here, but Republicans and Democrats are selling you the same product. Republicans are selling it by saying, let's reduce taxes. Democrats are selling it by saying, let's increase spending. But either one of those two things is going to result in a high deficit. And what does that reflect? It reflects like there's more spending right now than they're collecting in revenue, which I agree with the modern monetary theorists. That's not a problem. It's not a problem because the government can borrow, and they can, as long as the economy is expected to grow, they can borrow against that future growth. Just like if you knew your income was going to go up, like why do we borrow for college? We borrow for college because going to college gets you a higher income. You're basically borrowing against that higher income to pay for college today. So like that's what deficits are. But like we can just think about, we can actually ignore the deficit part too altogether. To start with, like just what's government spending do? Government spending is the government consuming resources that otherwise could be consumed by households or firms. So
Okay, help me on that. The government is a consumer of resources, the federal government?
Yeah.
Because the MMT perspective that I've been indoctrinated into says the government produces the currency. It doesn't consume
No.
it.
So we're not. That's why I'm trying to take money out.
Yeah,
of
thank
it.
you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Take money out of
So
it.
the
Like
resource the government consumes is not money. You're not saying they're consuming
No, I'm
dollars.
saying they consume asphalt. Like they're a consumer of asphalt. They're
To build road systems and highways.
Yeah, like they build roads. They are taking asphalt that may or may not have been used by households to pave their driveways or firms to build their own roads, private roads. They're consuming asphalt. They're consuming, bombs. Like
test kits.
Think about real resources. And so as the government consumes any of these resources, they're raising the price of those resources. And so like they're creating excess demand, or they're creating extra demand for those resources. And so when we think at the aggregate level, as the government consumes goods, they're creating more demand in the economy. What happens then? Well, if they're creating demand, I could tell you, hey, someone has to make that stuff. So their demand is expansionary because they're paying there's a worker on the other end who's getting more resources. So this is like the New Deal type thing.
Yep.
Why should you build dams across the entire Southeast? Well, that employs people. Those people then turn around, spend the resources that you gave them, and that creates there's a multiplier effect. And so some people think government spending is a good policy decision because of these multiplier type effects. So a unit of resources spent by the government creates more than one additional unit of resources in the economy. Alternatively, the government could, what's something the government does that they don't necessarily need to do? Suppose that, like, this is not reality, but suppose that there was a firm that wanted to build roads, a highway system. If the government goes and builds a highway system, they're doing something that a firm would have done. And so they're reducing firm spending on resources. And so there's crowding out, which is the flip side. And so what Republicans and Democrats are debating about often is whether or not crowding out dominates or multiplier effects dominate. And so, and notice, nothing I'm saying has anything to do with money. This is about real resources. So the question is, when the government consumes resources and they employ other people and stuff like that, does that cause extra spending in the economy? Or does it eliminate spending from the economy because they're doing something that someone else would have done? Or you're going to have to pay for the spending at some point, either today or tomorrow. They're either going to tax you today to pay for it, or they're going to tax you in the future to pay for it.
Well, okay, but hang on. But that point right there is the one I want you to clarify for me.
Yeah.
In order to pay for something, the federal government produces new money to pay for everything. Taxes don't pay for things. Taxes alleviate the amount of money in the system. New dollars. So this is helpful, Ron, because this is the thing I feel like happens.
I heard that said. I heard that said, and I just don't think that's the right way to think about it, because that's like saying when I work because that's creating new dollars in my bank account, and when I go to the restaurant, like that's taking dollars out of my bank account. Like there's accounts here, there's accounting. And so my point would be to say, like, it's not about new versus old dollars. It's about, like, there's a ledger, and as you tax people, dollars are flowing into the government. As you issue currency, dollars are flowing out of the government, or actually they're being spent on stuff. And so those are both forms of revenue for the government.
I get that. So what I've come to be told and believe is that what you described is true for everyone except the federal government that has a treasury. The treasury and the IRS are different. When I pay my money to the Minnesota state, in taxes, they put it into a Minnesota state tax or into a Minnesota state bank account. And then the revenues come out, and that's why they can't run a deficit. We're deficit limited here, and they can only either borrow from other banks or they can use tax dollars. The federal government, on the other hand, doesn't have a bank account. When you send your check to the federal government, they don't deposit that into a bank account in the ledger. They simply remove it from your bank account, and then it disappears. And new dollars is what the federal government always spends. This feels like the big distinction between the people who talk about that's the same money cycling all the time, and any new money is coming from somewhere else being borrowed and then is put in our system. And the MMT people say, like, there's nowhere else that dollars come from. Dollars only come from the federal government's treasury. So when we spent $2 trillion during COVID, they didn't like go into a bank account and get that. They went to the U.S. Treasury and produced it. Is that wrong? That view? That, I mean, this thing that's become sort of I don't know, lodged in my brain and maybe in all the MMTers' heads.
So I'm going to be honest. Like, I don't know the mechanisms by which the government is transferring resources across its, like, from the IRS to the Treasury. I think, like, what you're saying is an oversimplification of, like, what's going on in reality, which in reality it's, okay, I want to spend a bunch of money. The mechanism you're describing is dollars flow into the IRS. They go away. They get put in the trash. The government pays for stuff with new dollars that are all printed. From an accounting perspective, that's no different than if, like, that's actually wasteful in the sense of, like,
it seems to be describing the same thing. There's two buckets. Like, there's the federal bucket and there's everybody else.
Accounting is like, okay, maybe I throw away all the tax dollars, and that just means I have to print more money today than I planned, or I could have recirculated like that. Maybe that's a cheaper way to do it. And that's the way they do it. But the point is, from an economic standpoint, they're no different. It's no different than if I took the dollars you pay me, walk it over to whoever pays for stuff, like the Department of Agriculture or something, and say, hey, spend these dollars versus spend new dollars. That doesn't matter. Like that, it is identical. And
well,
so,
here's why I suggest it's not identical, because in the state budget model or my bank account model, I can only spend the money if it comes into me from somewhere. The federal government doesn't have that limitation. They don't have that accounting demand. Yeah. The accounting demand that you're saying exists everywhere, they don't have it. So it would be like I'm baking.
What I'm trying to say is it doesn't matter if I burn the dollars you pay your taxes with and then I print a bunch of new dollars, because that is just changing how many new dollars am I printing. The point that you're making right now is that they can always print more money than they brought in. That's one solution. That is a solution. The
reason I think it's different for the federal government is that the federal government is what makes a growing economy possible. So 10 years ago, we had, you probably know the numbers from the GDP deflator, like how much US dollars existed in the world. That number 10 years ago is smaller than that number now, and the number now will be smaller than 10 years. We're going to keep expanding. So where does that expanding money come from? Not recycling the old money. It's putting new money in, and more than ever went in. So the big difference is it's like if I was baking cookies and I had this amount of dough and I divide it all up into little cookies, and I'm like, but you just ate those cookies and then you metabolized them. Now I don't have any more dough. Now I have to go borrow dough from you. I'm not borrowing dough. I'm just going to make new dough because I own all the capacity to make dough. I'm confusing this with using dough as money.
I'm not debating the idea that the federal government can print more dollars. That's not the issue at hand. The issue at hand is what's the effect. So why does the currency grow? The currency grows because, so let me go back to this. We can talk about why the economy works the way it does without thinking about money. You and I could just trade resources. So then we got to have a question of, why does money exist in the first place? Money exists in the first place to facilitate transactions. So your wife has a yoga studio, so she's selling yoga as a product. My wife consumes yoga, so and is a therapist. So if your wife wants to trade. Yeah, they can do a trade. They don't need money to do that. They can do a trade. So then the question is, why? Someone just said this guy's desperate to disprove MMT. I'm not desperate to disprove MMT. Say MMT's
Danny, I'm the one desperate to disprove MMT. If anybody, I'm trying to make sure I'm not caught in a money cult.
So, you can talk about the economy without talking about money. So then the question is, why is there money? There's money to facilitate transactions, because I'm selling economics classes and not everybody wants economics classes. So instead, you can pay me cash, or I get a wage in dollars, and I can use those dollars to buy other stuff. And so money exists to facilitate transactions. So then why is there a certain amount of currency in the economy? That's like an endogenous object. Sorry, that's an object that's responding to the demand for transactions, not the thing that's generating transactions. So I would disagree that printing currency is the quantity of dollars. So if I say you need dollars for transactions, if there's too few dollars, that's going to cause a recession, because there's not going to be enough transactions. If there's too many dollars, that's going to cause inflation, because there's more dollars than we need for transactions. And so we have excess dollars floating around, so we're just going to raise prices. So those two things.
But does that, okay, so I have two things. One, does that second thing happen? Do we have any proof anywhere in the system that too much money in a economy like the United States has caused inflation. Every inflation moment has come from a lack of resources, not from too much money. So this sort of notion that, well, too little money would cause a problem, then too much also must. I'm questioning that. How do we know that to be the case?
Yeah, so this gets back to don't reason from a price change. So why could prices change? Prices could change because there's limited supply of resources. So that's like the beginning of COVID. Everything shut down. Supply chains locked up. There's a limited supply of resources that led to price levels across the board going up. Alternatively, you can have demand changes. So if everybody just decides for some reason, like I want to spend more of my resources for my lifetime today, that's going to cause prices to go up. And then the third thing is this monetary. So like monetary fluctuations are a source of business cycle fluctuations, like booms or recessions and booms, just like supply and demand fluctuations. So what I mean by that is the Federal Reserve screwing up how much currency there is in the economy, and how much money, and then in turn how much money supply can generate economic boom or an economic bust, just like limited supply of real resources or changes in demand for real resources. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I know that that's been the system that people have been thinking about. And the Federal Reserve has taken that approach. And when they wanted to get to 2% inflation in the United States as a good amount so that you have sort of cost of living increases and keeping an economy growing, they tried to create more available money for 15 years by cutting interest rates. It didn't work. Anywhere in the world, we haven't been able to cause.
Which 15 years are you talking about?
The last 15 years,
So
trying to drive up inflationary realities by making more money available by lowering interest rates. That's, as I understand it, what the Fed has in their toolbox. Like, hey, there'll be a lot more money if you can borrow $200,000 rather than borrowing $150,000. We'll have more money, and more money then will cause inflation to increase, which is what the Fed wanted because they were nervous that there wasn't enough inflation happening. But that's not what's happened. So
no, that's not what's happened. That's not what happened at all. They missed.
So why did having more money in the economy not cause inflation?
Okay, so something to keep in mind is that over the last decade, or 10 to 15 years, from December 2008 to December 2015, the interest rate that they control was stuck at zero.
Right.
And so they lost the ability to facilitate the economy in the way you're describing.
Because they had pegged their
Because it's pegged.
Yeah.
Yes. So
because they pegged it to zero. Yeah. Okay, I got that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then the question is, what did they do instead? And what they tried to do instead was they purchased government debt at long-term, they purchased long-term government debt, 10, 30-year debt. And they purchased they purchased basically bundled mortgages. So why'd they do that? They did that in an attempt to reduce interest rates for anybody who's borrowing long-term or anyone who's borrowing on a house. And so the idea was exactly what you're describing. The theory was, if I reduce those rates, people will borrow more. They will spend more on these things. That'll get us the inflationary pressures. And all of my research projects right now are meant to say, hey, why doesn't quantitative easing, what they did from 2009 to 2015, and then what they're doing now, why didn't that create inflation when lowering the interest rate does create inflation? When we think about, no. So if we go back to, so why do I say
how do we know it does?
Yeah. So the one example I'm going to give of it definitely works is the exact example that your guest 2 weeks ago said is wrong. So like we
Okay.
have a fundamentally different
Yeah, good.
understanding of what happened. So Paul Volcker took over the Federal Reserve in the 1980s, and he said, hey, inflation's out of control. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do whatever's necessary to limit inflation. And so at the time, the way they talked about monetary policy was not through managing the interest rate, so the federal funds rate like they talk about now. It was through talking about currency growth in the way I described earlier. And so what he did is he basically committed to not growing the currency at all until inflation was under control. And he didn't care. His commitment device is he came out and said, I don't care if it hurts the economy. I literally don't care. I'm going to do this because I want inflation to be back below, I mean, it was at 10% or whatever in the 70s. And so he's committed to that, and he followed through on his commitment. And so what he did is reduce the growth rate of the money supply, or reduce the growth rate of currency. So all they actually control is the growth rate of currency.
Yep.
The actual amount of money in the economy depends on the banking sector. So his commitment was, I'm not going to grow currency until inflation's back to where I want it. Now, what changed since then? Because we don't talk about money growth anymore. Now we talk about the interest rate. And so the idea there is like, why do we talk about these two different things? Well, from the perspective of the monetary authority, like both of those two things are free. But given the other limitations, if I pick one, it implies the other. And so they have the ability to, now, like I have a former colleague Mike Belongia, who will say like, no, the Fed never, like they should have never stopped paying attention to money growth. Like they should only talk about money growth. And there's a debate to be had there. But the point is like, we talk about two instruments of monetary policy, the growth rate of the currency or the interest rate. And we use those two things interchangeably. And so anywhere that I see, it's like in 1980, this lack of, we lowered rates. Wait, when I got this backwards, raised rates, reduced the growth rate of the money supply, and that resulted in disinflation. So the inflation rate lowered.
Yeah, that's super helpful, and I know what you're talking about because in our conversation with Fadl, Professor Fadl Kaboub 2 weeks ago, he said, "Hey, that's what I was taught was that the Volcker approach to interest rates is what stopped the inflation of the 70s." And he said, now looking at it, we know what caused the end of inflation in the 70s was the end of the oil embargo, because oil embargoes are one of the things that can cause inflation through the whole system. So it wasn't that they cut off the amount of new money coming into the system. It was, or the amount of money circulating through the system through interest rates. It was the supply side, it was the supply side. That was the problem. Not that there was too much money. Him obviously making the argument, there ain't no such thing as too much money. Like that's just that, and other people saying that there is. So I mean, and I love this. This is so helpful. You've been so good on this. I would also say that, and I would love to hear your reaction to this. The idea that money replaces the barter system, and so money is a better tool, currency rather, is a better tool for bartering because, you might have beans and I have rice, but Dan has wheat. And so somehow you don't want wheat and I don't want, so then we use a third party option, currency, in order to facilitate transactions. That's the explanation that's been given. We all heard that in, I don't know, 6th grade economics or something. Curiously, these MMT people and the anti-government libertarians tend to say things like, no, that's not why we have currency. The governments produce their own currency in order to control behavior and facilitate behaviors. We want you to do certain things that affect the collective experience and be part of this economy, not to facilitate transactions. That feels like a fundamentally different explanation for why we have currencies. Do you hear, is that a conversation in your world at all? Or is that only a conversation that happens? Because if you listen to, Stephanie Kelton's book, kind of chapter 2 is, here's why I was told we have currency. And I don't think that's why we have currencies. But is that a live conversation in your world, or is that just an MMT?
Well, okay, so this is a big point when talking about MMT that I think is useful, which is the question is what's monetary policy and what's fiscal policy. So everything you just described, I think the federal government does. Like the federal government doesn't tax churches for some reason. I don't know. I guess I should be careful what I say on the pastor on here. But like the federal government doesn't tax churches for some reason.
And that's to encourage that behavior. Like it's basically
like whether or not it's whatever. We don't get into that.
Yeah. Well, okay. We will get into that when you're done, because I'm not sure all churches are a public benefit and deserve the support of the federal government.
Yeah, I think that's what we're all getting at.
About that in a minute.
Incentivizing the incentive structure is a fiscal policy question. So, in my opinion, the Federal Reserve should do one thing. They should follow the constitutional mandate that they were given. The constitutional mandate says, do whatever you need to do to keep the price level stable. So keeping inflation at whatever they say they want it to be, while also maximizing employment. And they're balancing those two things because obviously, like, money creation creates booms. Booms mean there's lower unemployment. So money creation can create booms, but money creation also is inflationary in the sense that the more money there is in the economy, the easier it is to engage in these transactions. That doesn't necessarily change the number of transactions that I want to have. And so instead, the transactions become more expensive. So that's what inflation is. And so the Federal Reserve, in my opinion, should just focus on this trade-off between inflation and unemployment and not get into anything else. Everything else you're describing, yes, in the current system, it's done via money, because like money's the medium of exchange. However, it's not about money. It's about incentivizing behaviors. It's about subsidizing corn production. Mm-hmm. It's about changing the behaviors by changing the set of rules. That's fiscal policy. And so, like, I think it's really important to ask ourselves. So, like, for instance, right now, there are a lot of people advocating for the Federal Reserve to kind of expand what it's supposed to do and start considering other things in its decision making. I think that's like really bad, because that is Congress people punting on their responsibilities and putting their responsibilities as elected officials on non-elected bureaucrats. And I don't think that's the way the system's designed to work. I don't have... So like my politics about what the federal government should look like and what behaviors it should incentivize has nothing to do with my opinions on like what inflation is and why it's important to fight inflation. So like, first off, why is it important to fight inflation? Because so I know this is the common good, like there's a common good narrative here. So like, to me, fighting inflation is like the first best thing to do to promote the common good, because what you're doing is you're maintaining people's purchasing power. If we have 10% inflation and you make $50,000, well, next year, if you make the same amount of money, you just lost 10% of your purchasing power. That's not promoting the common good. So like inflation, in my opinion, is like one of the biggest risks to the average American that they don't have much say over. And so that's why it's really important to worry about. It's so important. Like the US is unique in the sense that we have this balancing of inflation and unemployment. If you go to Canada, they just their mandate is inflation targeting. That's it. Don't worry about anything else. Just make sure inflation's stable.
Is that because in Canada there's a social system that takes care of some of the things that in the United States employment takes care of?
I don't
so they
know.
don't have to be as concerned about the unemployed. Like in the United States, if you get unemployed,
you also lose your health care. Yeah,
you lose lots of. It's like it's a bad day. Where in other countries, you lose your job, you're like, all right, I'm gonna, there's a structure that'll help me survive it. Like we are employment committed in this country. We have decided that being employed is
It's a big deal.
almost a requirement.
Yeah.
You know,
I think it's a simpler argument than that and more theoretical. Like theoretically, if I maintain inflation, I'm going to also, in most cases, keep unemployment relatively fixed. And so I think it's more abstract and theoretical than a practical thing. I think a lot of times we need to be careful when talking, when economists are communicating with the general public, like everything you just said is true. Like in Canada, being unemployed is less of a shock to you individually. I think that's more putting like a narrative that we can see now on it than necessarily why it was structured that way. But
so you're saying that the reason to stay employed, to keep the employment rate down and make sure more people are employed, has economic health reasons, not just personal benefit or personal pain implications. You're saying we need employment to stay high because that's how the economic system functions?
No, what I'm trying to say is if I maintain stable inflation, I'm also going to maintain a stable employment rate most of the time. So I'm simplifying things by only targeting inflation.
Why are those two things so connected? Why does inflation and
unemployment? Well, so the use. Okay, so this is another layer of this. You look very connected. They don't look as connected now.
Yeah, I've never heard this.
I'm of the opinion that they don't look as connected now because we're like ignoring things that exist that affect that relationship. But in general, you just think of it as like, why are those two things related? Well, there's high inflation during booms. There's also low unemployment during booms. There's low inflation during recessions, typically, like demand-driven recessions. There's going to be lower inflation, like at the start of COVID. So when there's recessions that are demand-driven, inflation and unemployment are moving in the same direction, unemployment's high and inflation's low. And so like they just co-vary over the business cycle in such a way that they do tend to trend together. Now they don't always move in the same direction. And so getting at like, that's again, don't reason from a price change. Like if it's supply stuff going on,
okay.
It could very well, like right now, unemployment rate's super low and we still have high inflation. And so that's like, that's supporting my argument.
Mm-hmm.
My point is just that like they don't always move in the same direction, but they typically do. And so from a theoretical standpoint, if I stabilize inflation, I'm also going to stabilize the unemployment rate. And so the US system is maybe a little more complicated than Canada's in terms of these objectives. So, but again, like I want to go back to the original point, which is to say, this is what the Federal Reserve's told to do. Everything else that we want the federal government to do
is Congress.
Is fiscal policy. And that's designing incentive structures. It just so happens that the numeraire, that's a fancy word for the unit, of all of our transactions is dollars.
Yeah. And
transactions are about real resources. They're not about dollars.
I hear you. That's so well said. And that is such a helpful turnkey for a new way of thinking about this. And the place that it comes into where those two meet, though, is that Congress is right now trying to decide fiscal policy. Are we going to invest in daycare? Are we going to invest in soft infrastructure, as it's often called, the Build Back Better stuff? And the reason some people, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema specifically, are saying, I'm not for this, is because now they shift over and say, because it's going to cause inflation. So politicians then won't keep these two issues separate. They will now say, well, we know what causes inflation, and that is too much money in the system. And then some economists say, we don't know when that's ever happened. Maybe there's a correlation, but not causation. Like maybe that's happened, but it's only demand that's going to cause inflation. So it feels like the fundamental political question today, the one that you're saying, get this off the Federal Reserve and get it onto Congress. The people in Congress are saying, but we hear from the people at the Federal Reserve that what's going to cause inflation is too much money in the system. So they use that then, and they run that index. You probably know the name of it, where Manchin wanted it to run through the not CBD, that's the oil, CBO.
Yeah,
and said, I need to see the inflation implications of this. And so then a bunch of people do their magic and they say, like, here's what it will do to inflation if we spend $2 trillion. And you're like, well, you didn't do that when it was military spending, and you didn't do that when it was COVID spending, but now you didn't do it when it was, hard infrastructure. You only want to do it on this one. So this is where the two, I guess, in our politics are, because we also are told, and I want to, and that's why we have you on and others, like, you want to listen to experts on this stuff and have them challenge your non-expert assumptions about things to sort of get better. So how do we, because we know a lot of people that are in Congress, like that's something we do. We talk to a lot of candidates, train a lot of candidates. Almost none of them are economists. Very few of them are like, I'm running for office because I was good at math. And I read an economics book and I said to myself, that's how I think about the world. So they're not really taking in, someone helps them understand what's going on. And so the what's actually going on feels like it's really essential to all of this. Is there a brand of economics? Like you've described, you're a monetary expert, and then other people do other kinds of economics. So it's obviously it's an ecosystem, not just one thing. Is there a group of economists who really think particularly about public implication of public spending? Like your expert banking, right? Who are the public spending other people? How do they think about the world?
Yeah. So.
And we're running out of time too. Sorry about this.
No worries.
20 after.
So what you're talking about is, if I was teaching this to students, I would go back to think about fiscal policy without money. What's fiscal policy doing? Fiscal policy is consuming resources. They can consume more resources by borrowing or by creating money. That's the MMT idea, is they can always create more money. Money creation gives them like real resources that they can then use to go buy real stuff. So that helps them boost their government spending, their consumption. And so when people say that it's inflationary, I think that it's easier to go back to that argument of like, government spending is about consuming resources in the economy and creates more demand. It's not about an influx of money. That's a different thing.
Okay.
The influx of money is a completely different mechanism that may or may not create inflation. And so when someone politicians are just going to say what they're looking for excuses to express their opinion in a way that sounds like they're backed by someone else.
Political cover, yeah.
Yeah, it's political cover. And so like my point would be that when the government consumes resources at all, that's generating demand in the economy. And then as they change the amount of resources that they're consuming, so like the Build Back Better bill will result in a bunch of new spending. And so like, what do I expect to happen with that? Well, I would expect that due to that extra demand, that's going to put upward pressure on prices in the system. And so the mechanism I have going on in my head about why that might be inflationary is vastly different than the narrative Joe Manchin's presenting. Now, the layer to that is, modern monetary theorists will say, the government doesn't collect taxes before they pay for stuff.
Yeah.
And that's true. They issue debt instead. And so when they issue debt, they're saying, hey, give me some cash. I'll give you this debt instrument. I'll pay you back interest. And so that's one way that if we talk about actual money, then the transaction that's going on there is they receive cash. The transaction that goes on when they collect taxes is they receive cash. Whether or not they burn that cash that they receive through debt issuance or taxes doesn't matter, because they create money then to make up the difference. So there's three ways that the government can create resources to spend: issue debt, collect taxes, or print money. All three of those things will give them, doing more of those three things gives them more of an ability to spend. Why is spending inflationary? Spending's inflationary regardless of how it's financed, because it creates extra demand in the economy.
Now the question, finish your thought if you...
I would say it just so happens that politicians like use inflation as a debate mechanism when it's convenient.
One of the main questions I
scare
had...
people into their own life becoming more expensive. That's why we do it. Yep.
One of the main questions I had, Ron, is... obviously, when you increase the amount of money in the system, that will cause inflation. But in the equation you sent me, this one-page document that was really great.
Yeah.
The other variables, if you can increase the amount of money in the system and increase the productivity of the system, does that mitigate the inflation? Like if you spend money to, boost childcare providers, which in turn lets more people work and that sort of thing, does that spending cause inflation?
Well, okay, so again, money creation's not necessarily spending. Money creation's a decision of the Federal Reserve, independent of fiscal policy. Spending, so money creation that is for the purpose, it's like think of it this way. Suppose the Federal Reserve creates some currency, they hand it over to the Treasury, and the Treasury spends it. Your question is that inflationary? And alternatively, the Federal Reserve could create some money and just give it to all of us. If they create some money and just give it to all of us, it's probably definitely inflationary.
Right.
Because, we didn't ask for it. It's just going to make the ease of doing transactions easier. And so it's going to cause the cost of transactions to become higher. That's inflation. Mm-hmm. Your question
and
is...
And I think MMT would agree with all that, right? MMT is very concerned with inflation. That's its only constraint on things.
Your question is, if the Federal Reserve prints money and they hand it to the Treasury and the Treasury spends it, if the Treasury were to spend it on things that improve the economic system and result in long-run GDP growth, then you're right. That's going to reduce the inflationary pressures. So, for instance, do I think that building the interstate system was inflationary? Probably not. Think about it intuitively. Building the interstate system makes it easier for everyone to get around the country. It lowers the transaction costs of shipments. And so that's going to result in faster shipments, more economic production. And so that's an example of government spending that, but the point is, building the interstate wasn't necessarily backed by money. Building the interstate was backed by debt. And so money creation is something to back spending, which is what modern monetary theory is hinging on, is a different thing.
I feel like, and we talked about, I started out with this little soliloquy about we have to use a different word than debt. When you say it was backed by debt, can you describe paint a picture of where that money comes from?
Yeah.
Where does debt?
Treasury has auctions. Treasury has auctions every week where they say, hey, we're committed to paying you X number of dollars 10 years from now, let's say.
Yep.
How much do you want to pay us for that? And so they have that auction, and people have the ability, banks participate in this auction, and banks are handing them dollars then. So it's a simple example would be suppose they want to borrow $1,000, or they make a claim to pay you $1,000 10 years from now. Someone might buy that claim at $950. And so the federal government receives $950 through the Treasury auction for that $1,000 claim 10 years down the road. Okay. And so that's what I mean by debt issuance, and where they're getting resources to actually do transactions. But again, you don't necessarily need to think about these resources in terms of dollars. It's in terms of the purchasing power of those things. So they got $950, but if it's not $950, it's how many Think of it like employing a person for a week. I like thinking about a lot of stuff in terms of how much labor are you getting out of those resources, because that's something we have a pretty good, like, we're able to think about
Mm-hmm.
in terms of hours of work.
So,
So
okay. If you have to go, please
no,
wrap.
I
This
Yeah,
is
we
so
should wrap it up
fascinating to me. I just love it.
at
Yeah,
some
probably
point,
should
but-
wrap it up at some point.
we can do
Because here's what I think's going on. And look, I think both the MMT world also has a little sleight of hand trick sometimes when they switch some phrasing about why things matter. Every system does. But I feel like you say at one moment, you can think about this without thinking about money, but you can't think about debt without thinking about money. If you're
Why?
going to say, well, what is debt if it's not money?
Debt's a claim to a future resource flow.
But
It
if
just
the
so
resource
happens,
flow is borrowing $900 or getting $950, then
but
you're
you don't
talking
get
about dollars,
no,
right?
no. But why would you want $1,000 10 years from now? How are you going to evaluate what that's worth to you? You're going to think about what you can buy with $1,000 10 years from now. And so again, and that's going to adjust for your inflation expectations over the next 10 years. But again, everything in my head is about what you're really getting, and money's just a convenient unit of measure. And so with debt, I'm giving up $950 today. That means I gave up 100 Panda Express meals, right? I think that's the right number. 100 Panda Express meals. I'm willing to give up 100 Panda Express meals today to have a claim to $1,000 10 years from now. And so whether or not I'm willing to do that has something to do with how patient I am, measuring today versus 10 years from now. What I think I'm going to be able to get 10 years from now, so I'm going to pay less today. I'm only going to give you $900 if I think there's going to be more inflation over the next 10 years, because inflation makes that $1,000 worth less to me in terms of Panda Express meals. So like, even when I talk about debt, in my head, I'm constantly dividing by the price level. And so
but you're suggesting the Treasury sells every day because they need the money.
They need the purchasing power of the money.
They need the purchasing power of the money, and they're only going to get it by getting it from you. So it's your money, your purchasing power articulated.
They can't. It's not only from you. So they issue debt. So what do they like? Think about the three mechanisms by which, and I think this is where MMT, one of their sleight of hands, based on the way you've described it.
Okay, yeah. This is the fundamental difference, I think, right here. Yeah.
Yeah, three mechanisms by which the federal government can accumulate resources to then go spend, which spending is a political decision. They decide how much they're going to spend. It just so happens that the tax structure is also typically part of the political decision.
Okay.
And so therefore, what's the Treasury do? The Treasury is making up the difference. Governments can create resources, though, for themselves in three ways. One, they can issue debt, which is what I'm describing. You give them cash today, they give you future cash. But when your head, what you're valuing is like future cash and current cash are not the same thing. And so you're thinking about what you can buy. You're giving up purchasing power today for future purchasing power. There's lots of reasons you might want to do that, like retirement savings.
Sure.
Okay, so you're giving up purchase. That's one way. That's debt issuance. Second way, collect taxes. They can just charge people for being a citizen because they want to. They could also have no taxes. They could, it's whatever. The tax system is a political decision. However, taxes, what's going on there? You're giving up some resource purchasing power for them to get some purchasing power. Mm-hmm. And then the third way would be printing money, which is what we call seigniorage revenue. In the United States, money creation is managed by the Federal Reserve, but we can think about the public sector as like a whole entity. And so when the Federal Reserve engages in money creation, that's like creating revenue for the federal government. And so MMT will often go into this, well, it's the ability to create money that leads us to not have to worry about deficits, basically not have to worry about the total debt level. And in my opinion, and I just think that lacks an understanding of like, yeah, they can create debt today, and yes, they can print money today. However, you can't just print unlimited money, because if I print unlimited money, that means there's more money flowing in the system without necessarily changing the number of transactions. That's going to lead to inflation. That's the point.
Sure. No, I hear you. Yeah. And that's a big pushback from the MMT people, as I understand it, is they say inflation is not caused by there being too much money. It's caused by there being too little resources. So I think that's they've right. Just said, proven over time. We don't think that's the problem. Here's how I think MMT people would say it. And I'm not, look, I'm just a nice guy. What do I know about this? They would say there's one way the federal government, separate from state, local, and county governments, one way the federal government can spend money. That's to make it. Taxes and
that's not true.
Taxes and borrowing, they would say, are mechanisms to control behavior and to control the amount of currency that's available in the system. This I think is the MMT argument.
I would say that.
No, you may disagree that they've moved from 3 to 1. Exactly, I think this is what they're saying.
I don't know if that's exactly what they're saying or not. But yeah. What you're describing though.
Yes.
You're just playing a numbers game. If you say like they issue debt and the $950 they collect, they just go burn and they then print $950 new. All you're doing is like that's fine if that's what they do, but all you're doing is playing just a numbers game.
Adding an extra step.
Yeah,
but the math is
not
still
because the money that comes to them, they don't need it. They could. Here's what MMT people, when you like talking private conversations, they'll agree to this. We don't have to have taxes at all for this to work. You could just stop having federal income tax, 100% stop it. The government would have no less money. You could just stop paying back, doing borrowing that causes people to take some of their money out of the system for 10 years, and then you'll put it back in the system 10 more years. You could do that, and the federal government would have just as much money today as it did yesterday when you had that system, because that is not where the money comes from at the federal level. They fundamentally, their description of reality is that's not the accounting that the federal government does.
That doesn't make any sense.
I think what MMT would say is theoretically that might be the case, but the only thing that MMT is concerned about is will it cause inflation? And I think MMT agrees that at a certain point it does.
Yeah, they say that at a certain point it does. Like,
okay, all right. Well,
we better pick that up,
people, because honestly, last week when we asked Fadl this, or 2 weeks ago, I said, you're really not concerned about inflation coming from too much money in the system, and he said, yeah, no, we're concerned about inflation coming from a lack of regulation that's going to allow people to stagnate the resources that are available.
I think his point is we haven't come close to the amount that he thinks would cause inflation from money supply.
Fair enough. But his point is the taxes and borrowing, taxes and bonds issues are used to regulate the amount of money that's in the economy. No, and that's it. It's not to produce the income that the government needs to pay its bills.
His point's flawed though, because the government is different than us in the sense that it can create money and you can't. But it doesn't mean you can throw out the budget constraint of the government. And that's what they do wrong. And you still have a budget constraint. It's just that you have an extra source of income in the budget constraint. Actually, they have two extra sources. They have taxes. You don't have access to taxes. You can't tax your neighbor. It'd be nice if you could tax your neighbor. Like if you have a bad neighbor. Yeah. I'd probably need to subsidize my neighbors.
That's right. I'd probably have a tax bill due.
They can collect taxes and they can print money. What his point is of like, if you say, well, they don't necessarily have to have taxes and debt. That's true. Yeah. You could do that. That still leaves one mechanism to create money. The question is just what happens if you do that? If every dollar.
Well, Republicans told us if we get rid of taxes, if we cut taxes, then it will cause the economy to grow. So
Yeah, but that's actually coming from the motivation, the same motivation that MMTers are using to say, like,
Yes.
inflation in the economy is driven by a lack of supply. If you believe that, you also are on the same side of, from a theoretical perspective, cutting the corporate income tax will lead to growth, because cutting the corporate income tax takes away investment resources for firms, and so will lead to more supply in the economy. And so, like, one thing I really don't understand about MMT is, like, they're coming at this from a supply side very often.
Yeah.
So they're actually, like, have more in common with some of the things they say. I'm like, you sound like you went to
it's like
University
you
of Chicago in the
No,
1970s.
come back around.
Yeah, no,
to-
for sure. Well,
Yeah,
I
it's
think
like,
that.
whoa.
Well, and I think that they don't want that. I think that there's a lot of things about the University of Chicago in the 1970s and the philosophical perspective you're getting at that they don't agree with. So I'm totally speaking out of school. This is just my interpretation after reading and listening to a bunch of this. They don't want to be as explicit about some of the things that make them sound like that. But when you really get into, they nuance it and say a little different. But fundamentally, it is the same thing. It is supply. And the thing they add in is the way you control for bad behavior is not taxes, and it's not a reward system of debt from the government and future payments. It is regulation. So what they want is an increased amount of regulation. That's where they differ from that 1970s group that wants less regulation. And that's really fundamentally, I think, when you get to those two, what this ultimately is going to lead to is, if you don't use money to motivate or money to demotivate, what do you use? Use the power of the government to regulate.
Yeah,
because
but again, like,
that's
fiscal policy. That's just fiscal policy. That's the thing. Like,
sure. And I think that's what they're talking about a lot of the times. I think they're literally, when you get into an MMT conversation, you're talking about what is modern monetary theory as it relates to government spending and to tax policy and to the, they're really in that specific world, trying to say, here's what a different world would look like economically.
Well, I think we're going to have to part 2 this one, guys. This has been great. Ron, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah.
We'd love to have you back and talk some more about this, because I've got more questions.
But I hope we don't have to pay the $2,400 fee that you have to pay for a semester's worth of economics courses at the University of Mississippi. Thank you. So good. Hey, lots of good
really
questions.
Appreciate
Thank you, Mike. Thank you all the people that did questions. But we've been an hour and 40 minutes. We gotta go. It's just unhealthy. All right. We'll see you all Monday.
Take care, everybody.